Parshas Chayei Sara is the conclusion of the trilogy of Avraham Avinu's career. Avraham has 3 parshios. Yaakov has 6 parshios. Yitzchak, not too many. Even his parsha isn't his. Maybe we'll talk about that on some other point, because this is Chayei Sara, not told us. But Chayei Sara, the third part of this trifecta, the conclusion of Avraham's career, is dramatically different than Lech Lecha and then Vayera. Both Lech Lecha and Vayera are very dramatic, supernatural. Hashem appears, Hashem promises, swears, covenants, mizbeach, kings, destruction, war, angels, supernatural visitations, mystical figures, Melchizedek, who knows who he is. Parshas Chayei Sara is very, very humdrum. That's why it's called Chayei Sara. It's very domestic. The only 2 events that transpire of major import is the location of a burial plot for Sara Imenu and a shidduch for Yitzchak Avinu. There are no malachim. Hashem doesn't appear in Parshas Chayei Sara. Yitzchak davens Hashem. Vayetzi Yitzchak lasuach basada. But it is dominated by those 2 stories. And those 2 stories, Me'aras HaMachpelah and finding Rivka, locating Rivka, identifying Rivka, could have been summarized in about 3 psukim. The Torah could have written that Sarah was Ne'asafa or Ne'asefes alameh vayikbar osa Avraham, as every single burial, except for Yaakov's, in the Torah is described. Moshe's burial, Aaron's burial, when people die, they're buried without much fanfare. Yet there's a long description of the negotiations over the land between Avraham and the Bnei Ches and Ephron, culminating in the acquisition. If you thought the story of Me'aras HaMachpelah was verbose and elaborate, well, the story of locating Yitzchak's Kala is even more elongated and more elliptical and more loquacious, let's say. A lot to talk about. We see Eliezer, or as he's presented, Eved Avram, as he's living through this test that he concocts, this mousetrap, whichever woman, whoever will feed him and his camels. And then we hear him reciting the story a second time to Lavan and to Besuel, to Rivka's family. So we're seeing the story twice, once as it happens in real time and once as Torah could have very easily written that Eliezer conveyed the events to Rivka's parents, and then, of course, the day after, whether Rivka will agree to immediately go or wait the 6 months or 12 months, Higiyaz Man v'lo nisu. The Torah is drawing our attention towards these 2 stories. Of course, Chazal detected it, that the description of the Avadim, of the Bnei Beso, of Avram are more beloved to HaKadosh Baruch Hu than the various laws in the Torah, because you can learn so much about morality and commitment and loyalty. But the Torah is also drawing our attention to these 2 stories. These 2 stories, the acquisition of Me'aras HaMachpelah and the dispatching of Eved Avram to locate a wife for Yitzchak, they're very parallel stories, and there are 6 or 7 or 8 parallel elements to them. The Torah wants us to read them together, to see them as a tandem story, so we can appreciate the contrast between the 2, and that contrast contains an important message. So very often the Torah will juxtapose 2 stories by highlighting similarities, so we better focus on the difference or the differences, which are all thematically similar, and that difference contains an important message. So what are the similarities between the acquisition of Me'aras HaMachpelah of Hebron and the identification of a bride for Yitzchak? So first of all, in each instance, there's a person that travels to the location where the decision, where the dramatic event will take place. Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sara v'livkosa. Avram travels, Chazal ask mehechan ba, different opinions, right now not important, but Avram's traveling to Hebron. Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sara v'livkosa. Of course, Eved Avram, vayelech kol turva, vayikach kol turva danav biyadav, vayakam vayelech. So obviously the Eved Avram has to travel to Aram Naharayim. Second of all, the drama unfolds in a very important, iconic, symbolic, public setting. In the case of the acquisition of Maras Machpelah, the Ephron Yoshev b'toch b'nei ches l'chol bo'ei shar iroch. As I'll say, he was appointed a judge that day, but this is taking place in the gate of the city, the entrance to the city, which in those days was the gathering place, the place where the tribunal sat, the place where acquisitions took place. Shar iro, shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol shirecha asher Hashem Elokecha nosein lecha lishvatecha. In the case of Eved Avram, Hine anochi nitzav alein hamayim. Doesn't take place in the gates of the city. It takes place at the waterways, at the well, which of course is where Yaakov will encounter Rachel as well. But this is where Moshe encounters Sipora and her sisters being abused, exploited by the other shepherds. So a lot of the action takes place at wells or in gates. So this is an important event. Someone travels to attend this event, and the event unfolds not in private, but in a very public sphere, whether it's the acquisition of Maras Machpelah or the selection of Rivka. Now here's where it gets very interesting. In each instance, there is an intermediary, namely, the solicitor doesn't have direct access to the person who could grant him his wish. He has to go through a middleman. It's very clear that the middleman in Hebron, the middlemen are Bnei Ches, and Avram's first round of negotiation takes place with Bnei Ches, and he wants a feel for Sara, and they tell him, don't worry, but introduce me, Figuli Be'efron Ben Sochar. In Aram Naharayim, it's a little more symbolic, because the middleman is actually a middle woman. The people that are going to make the decision, and that make the decision, are Lavan and Besul. It's pretty clear they're making the decision. They may listen to Rivka for her input, but they have to decide to pull the trigger. Rivka is actually the middleman or the middle woman between Eved Avram, Eliezer, and Besul. And Eved Avram says, who are you? Do you have place for me? Take me to your parents. So in each case, there's round one with the middleman, and then round 2 and 3 with the person who's going to make the call. And that leads us to the fourth similarity, that in each case there really are 3 rounds, as I said. Round 1 with the middleman. In the case of Aram Naharayim, Rivka, she is the middle woman. In the case of Hebron, it's Bnei Ches. And then Avram, in the case of Hebron, Eliezer, in the case of Aram Naharayim, gets introduced to the people that are going to make the decision, but then there are 2 rounds. Avram has 2 rounds with Ephron, until he actually acquires the land, and Eliezer has 2 rounds with Lavan and Besul. First when he tells the story, and they say no problem, and then the next day where they have to decide how quickly Rivka should accompany Eliezer back to Eretz Yisrael. And just in case you didn't realize that there are 3 different rounds, each round is punctuated by a hishtachava. Now, hishtachava, of course, is a ritual moment where we bow to Hashem, but it's also, as in different cultures, where you nod, where you accept, where you show deference. So after the first round, getting back to Hebron, Vayishtachu lam haaretz livnei ches, Avram bows his head to Bnei Ches. Then he has a conversation with Ephron, and then Vayishtachu Avram livnei haaretz, because they're all listening, so he bows down to everyone, and then finally the deal is sealed. In Aram Naharayim as well. After Hashem provides Rivka for Eliezer, she's the one that provides the water. Then he has a whole long song and dance with Lavan and Besul in their home. When they agree, Eved Avram is divrehem, that they acceded, So in each case, both in Hebron and Aram Naharayim, the 3 rounds are separated. Each round is separated from its previous round by a hishtachava, by a pause in the action for people to thank the other party for their role and to move on after hishtachava. See, people traveling from a foreign location, arriving at a very iconic place, whether it's the gates of the city in Hebron or the waterways of Aram Naharayim, you have 3 different rounds, and you have intermediaries. Of course, both negotiations are centered around money. In the case of Avram, of course, hakesef shadim b'aznei bechez, hakesef natzlecha, kicha Mr. Ephron. Anyone that's studied Maseches Kedusha knows that the acquisition of Maras Machpelah is the source for Kedusha Kesef, ki ikach isha, kesef nesati lecha, hasada kach mimeni. And in the case of Eliezer, it's not really money, but it's more jewelry and wealth. There's a lot of money that's being exchanged. And he tells Lavan himself, by the way, there's more money where this came from. Avram is very wealthy. And then, of course, finally, just to highlight the similarity between these two events, they take place in a public setting, and these events are witnessed by spectators. Now, the spectators in Hebron are clear, the Bnei Ches, and it says the Bnei Ches 10 times. I'm not going to get into why it says 10 times Bnei Ches, Kineged Aseres Adibros. What does Aseres Adibros have to do with Bnei Ches in Hebron? It's a very bizarre Medrash Chazal, which requires a lot of explanation and a lot of explication. Who are the spectators that are viewing the negotiations between Eliezer, Eved Avraham, and Rivka, and Besuel, and Lavan? It's the camels. If you read Chayei Sara carefully, the camels are mentioned 12 times. Now, why the camels are so important and why they're so iconic, that's for a different time. But the camels are watching, and the camels are ubiquitous, and the camels are ever present. So these two stories are very, very parallel. The solicitor, the petitioner, travels to an iconic place with people watching, meets a middleman, goes through 3 rounds, each round separated by a bowing of the head. And of course, money has to be exchanged for these acquisitions and selections to be successful. So the Torah wants us to read these 2 sections, and these are the only 2 sections in Chayei Sara. The Torah wants us to read them in parallel, in tandem, so that we appreciate the differences. What are the differences between what's happening in Hebron and what's happening in Aram Naharaim, even though they're so similar, because you have to see similarities to appreciate the differences, and why does it matter? So first of all, who's in position of power? Who's leveraging whom? Anytime there's a confrontation, but an encounter, we know who's got the leverage, who's in a position. In the case of Avram, it's very clear that he's a ger v'toshav anechi imachem. Ephron Yoshev b'toch b'nei ches. It's a home game for Ephron. He's with his people, with his party. Chazal say, Ephron Yoshev b'toch b'nei ches. Oso hayom minu oso. They appointed him as a judge, as a leader, as a politician. So it's very clear that Ephron is holding all the cards. Avram is begging, Avram is pleading. Yado al halyona. Ephron has the control of the situation. In the case of Eliezer, although he's the visitor, he's in the catbird seat. He's in the driver's seat. Hinei anochi nitzav alein hamayim. Nitzav is a position of authority. Lakim nitzav badaskel. Atem nitzavim hayom. Nitzvu komod neid nozlim. So he's in a hinei anochi nitzav. Shoshan Hashem nitzavim alav. I'm standing by the well, and this woman will have to come to me. It's very interesting. Avram's the beggar. Ephron's in control of the situation. And Aram Naharaim, Eved Avram, is running the show and directing and calling the shots. Number 2, the conversation in Aram Naharaim couldn't go more swimmingly. As soon as Eliezer finishes his proposal, Vayan Lavan Ubesul Vayamu Me'Hashem Yatsa Davar. Lo nuchal daber elach harautav. We can't say, lo, we're holding ourselves back from interceding, from objecting. Kodesh Baruch Hu is directing this process. We have nothing to say. In Hebron, it's very, very complex, very complicated, very frustrating, and you get this by the words and by the word lo. Listen to these 2 lows that take place in Hebron. Shma'inu Adoni, Nasi Elokim Ata B'Zocheinu. We love you, Avram. You're a prince. B'mavchar Kavareinu Kavaras Meisecha. Bury wherever you want. And then it gets, wait a second. Ish es kivro lo yechlem mimcha mikvar misecha. We won't hold back. Just say, we'll give it to you. Lo yechle. Sounds like they want to give it, they don't really want to give it, and the lo is like a subliminal lo. We don't really want to give you the grave, but of course we will, because you're going to see it. And that passive-aggressive hostility that's latent in the answer of Bnei Ches comes to the fore. A couple of psukim later, 5 psukim later, pasuk Yud Aleph, Vayomer. Now this is Ephron speaking. Lo Adoni. No. It sounds like, no, I'm not going to give it to you. Shma'inu. Listen to me. Shma'ini. Hasadeh nesati lecha. I've just offered to pay you. Kesef malay. I've just offered to pay you. What are you saying? No. It's like they're not talking to each other. There's no communication. There's broken communication. I've just offered to pay. And everyone's response is, Lo. Adoni shma'ini. Hasadeh nesati lecha v'emar sherbo. So they're giving, but they're not giving. They're relinquishing, but they're not relinquishing. There's a lot of lows. In Aram Naharaim, the low is, we can't intercede, we can't barrier, we can't prevent. Here it's, no, I'm not going to grant you your wish. So all of a sudden, it seems a little bit eerie, a little bit ominous, when you recognize the difference between the successful negotiation in Aram Naharaim and the very long and arduous and tedious and painstaking where Ephron's in charge, and he keeps saying lo, even though he's saying yes. And then the broken communication is even more apparent because everyone is telling each other in Hebron, listen to me. When you're in the middle of a conversation with someone, you don't say listen. You've got their attention, you've got their hearts, you've got their interest, and you're just having an interaction. When someone's not listening to you, when you're not on the same page and the same frequency, listen, you don't understand. I need to make my point. I'm not being heard. Listen to how many times people are saying, listen to me in Hebron. Shma'enu Adoni, Pasuk Vav. Shma'uni, Avram tells the people of Bnei Ches, listen to me, ufiguli. La Adoni, Ephron tells Avram, Shma'ini, listen to me. So a lot of people who aren't fully agreeing and listening, so everyone's telling each other, listen, listen. No one's saying listen to each other in Aram Naraim. In fact, the sensory expressions in Aram Naraim are not auditory, listen to me, but are optical. I'm standing by the well, but the wells, of course, look like an eye because it had a circumference. If anyone knows the wells in Israel, Ein Sukkar and Ein Bekat, and because the well had a little round circumference of stones within which was the water, so it looked like an eye. But I'm standing by the eye, and the woman looks good, and they see the goal. No one has to say anything. They're all collaborating. There's unison of purpose. There's cooperation. So something strange is happening in Hebron that isn't happening in Aram Naharaim. Aram Naharaim, Eliezer's in charge. Conversation smooth. No one has to say, listen to me. And then, of course, the final difference, these are very subtle differences, but they're very fascinating, is the pace in Hebron is really slow. This should happen overnight. It's just a field, not a marriage. And there's a lot of stagnancy, and everything is stationary, and everything is static. How do you see this? Because anytime there's a surge forward, the Torah writes the word vayakam. Vayakam Avraham el pnei Mesor. He gets up from eulogizing. Vayakam Avraham ishtach v'lamaretz. He gets up and he bows down. Vayakam stay Ephron, and the lands now are secured by Avraham. Vayakam asad v'amar. Of course, the last two Vayakams are not describing human action, but they remind us there's a lot of people who are standing up because, not that they were sitting or lying down, but there has to be new energy provided because everything has reached a stagnation, everything has reached a rut, everything has slowed down. In Aram Naharaim, remember, it's one day. We don't really know how long Ephron and Bnei Ches and Hebron take, but it's one day in Aram Naharaim, and the Torah writes 3 times, Vayaratz ha'ever likrasa. When he sees Rivka, he runs towards her. Vataratz od ha'lebe'er l'shov. And Rivka sees the camels and she runs. Vayaratz Lavan alish hachutza. And when Lavan sees Avram, he runs. So just think about, in Aram Naharaim, the word Vayaratz, Vataratz appears 3 times. In Hebron, the word Vayakam. So in one case, everyone's running. In one case, everyone's standing still or getting up to break the to break the inertia. So there are 2 negotiations with 2 visitors in 2 public places, with spectators, with middlemen about important issues, but they seem to be very different. One is smooth, one is complicated. One is healthy communication, one is broken communication. One is Avraham and his agent running the show and directing the activity, and one is Avram being the petitioner. Why are we seeing these 2 stories as different? The answer is because these 2 stories are iconic. They're not just stories. One story is about Avram spreading his influence globally. Remember, this is the first time that Avram has been able to spread the knowledge of Hashem and to spread the wealth of Vayei Bracha outside of the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. He did a pretty good job in Lech Lecha and certainly in Vayera, Avimelech, the locals. He placated the war. He ended the war. He establishes an Eshel. But all this action takes place in Eretz Yisrael. He's meant to be an Avamon Goyim. This is the first time. It's not just a shidduch excursion. This is a chance for Avram's Eved, as the representative of Avram, to bring Avram's messages and to bring Avram's bracha to the broader world. And that's why the Torah makes such a big deal about it. Without getting into the details, that's why the Gemalim are so important, because to get from, let's say, Hebron to Har Moriah, a donkey suffices. To get from Hebron or even Yerushalayim to Aram Naharaim, you need a camel. And an animal is capable of long distance. So the camel symbolized long distance travel. They're able to hold their water, they're outfitted or specifically suited to travel in the desert. So the camels, and also to bring all the riches, because Avram's dual mission is not just to spread the gospel of Hashem, but also to provide bracha. And he does both, because by the time Eved Avram leaves, Lavan is already saying, well, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, once this happened, Lavan becomes the Mashgiach. Lavan understands HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's very interesting to see how immediate the impact of Avram and Eved Avram is upon Lavan, both spiritually and, of course, materially, by providing all the riches and wealth that Eved Avram provided. Namely, the mission of Avraham, the mission of the Jewish people, to spread the light, to spread religion, to spread monotheism, to spread spirituality, to spread wealth and prosperity and welfare. And that's something which the nations of the world, which humanity embraces. And by and large, especially in the modern era, we have been embraced by humanity as we have supercharged and fueled the march of science and technology and democracy and culture and equality. And the Jews have contributed so much to society when we've finally been given the chance to assist humanity in its march of history. So what's happening in Aram Naraim is not just a story about Rivka, it's that whole part of Avraham's Av Hamon Goyim universal role, spreading, again, spirituality and knowledge of Hashem, monotheism, and spreading material wealth and prosperity. There's a second part to the Jewish mission, and that's Hashem wants us to live in His land. And that's the mission which Avram first embarks upon in Chayei Sara, because until Chayei Sara he's a guest. He's a guest with Anu Eshkol Mamre, he's a guest of Melchizedek, he's a guest of Avimelech, he's a guest of Paro, he's a guest and a guest and a guest. This is the first land that he actually acquires. So he's beginning the L'Zarachat Eretz Hazos. That's the other part of Jewish destiny. That part of Jewish destiny, the right of the Jewish people to live in the land of Hashem, not so fast. That is not something that the Umas Olam are willing to cede. It was true then, it's true now. The world knows this is the land of Hashem, instinctually, subliminally. They don't want the Jewish people to live in the land of Hashem, because they desire to be part of the land of Hashem, and because they realize that when the Jewish people return to the land of Hashem, that's historically resonant. History is moving ahead, and history brings certain consequences and certain demands that much of the world doesn't want to embrace, like in Malchus Hashem. So Chayei Sara is a snapshot, a microcosm of the two poles of Jewish destiny, Jewish mission. One is Vehei Bracham, Avamon Goyim, teaching the world, bringing Hashem's presence to the world. Eved Avram is the agent, the messenger. Things could not go more smoothly. Everyone's running, everyone is talking to each other, there's complete synchronicity, everyone's aligned, cooperation, collaboration. Everyone's tough. Living in Eretz Yisrael is tough. Ironing out and carving out our place in this world and receiving international approval is rough. So it was then, and so it is now.